I'm going to speak to, my name's Tom Sorosiak, and I have authored a book, and it's the history of Nazareth Hall, and it goes back, it's just not about Nazareth Hall. It also speaks quite genuinely about the Ursuline Order of the Sacred Heart, the nuns who were at Nazareth Hall. I began this venture of writing this book probably 2.5 years ago. I had many years ago, I completed my master's degree at Eastern Michigan University, and my master's thesis was on Nazareth Hall at that time. And then, had to do a profession where I taught in the Toledo Public Schools for quite a few years, and then I went over to Owens, and from there I ended up at Bowling Green State University in the history department. And when COVID came to this country, I decided to retire after teaching for 6 decades. So I started in 1968 teaching, and I ended in 2017 or whatever. And my area of expertise, of course, was genocide and Holocaust. I had spent most of my time teaching and working in Europe, in Germany and Poland. Then I also had a Fulbright in sub-Saharan Africa. But I also did fellowships in Korea and Japan and Russia, the West at least. So when I sat down to write the book, it's not only a historical document based upon my researching documents, but also interviews of past students at Nazareth Hall, some of the sisters that taught there, and just general interviews. I have probably 150 to 200 original slides that I collected going back to the beginning of Nazareth Hall. I only have a few of them to give you an idea. So I completed the book, and I'm of Polish American ancestry. My parents, they spoke Polish at home. It was English was a second language, and so I retained my ability to speak Polish. But that's going away. More I don't speak it. But the book that I sell, which is I sell the book for $20, and all the profits from that book goes for a scholarship that is established through the Polish Cultural Center in Toledo, Ohio, for a student of Polish ancestry. And we've been doing this for quite a few years. So I don't benefit by the selling of the book. I thought it was a good way to give back to people that helped me along in my education. So what we'll do is, at any time, as I'm showing a couple of the slides and talking about Nazareth Hall, you have a question or just speak up loud, or I'll bring the microphone over and we'll go from there. Okay. The first slide I did show to you is an aerial view of Nazareth Hall. Nazareth Hall is located on Route 65, about 3 miles outside Grand Rapids.
Actually,
I'm sorry. Okay. All right. Thank you for telling me that. So this is the picture of Nazareth Hall. And Nazareth Hall was opened in 1928. Construction started about 1925. Most important thing to keep in mind about what I'm going to talk about today and what I wrote in the book is to always keep in mind a reference to time, especially contemporary time, because events that occur in this country directly impacted Nazareth Hall, just like events directly impact us. We purchase gas today for $4 a gallon. The events in the world impact us. And so you have to keep that in mind if you should purchase the book and are reading the book. You have to keep that in mind, okay? So this is the picture of the Nazareth Hall. I always give it a blank and don't make so much noise. So let me tell you where I begin with the book. The book begins with the Ursuline Order of the Sacred Heart of Sisters. And when I wrote the book, when I did my master's thesis, the only thing I did in my master's thesis was to cover the idea of building Nazareth Hall. I did not deal at all with the Ursuline Order, except to say they were the nuns that taught at Nazareth Hall. But when I did the book, it was really important to understand the philosophy behind why Nazareth Hall was built. So I began reading and I became a honorary Ursuline nun based upon all the books that I read. And so as a result, I had to put that into the book. And the book begins actually in the year 500 as far as the Ursuline Order. It goes back to Europe. And of course, the Ursuline Order of the Sacred Heart was a religious order of the Catholic faith. And there in the book, I mentioned how and who was totally involved in creating the Ursuline Order of the Sacred Heart. But probably the most important part of that early aspect of this book and talking about the Ursuline Order is what the order's philosophy was way back in 500, the year 500, and actually almost to the year 500 to 1500. And it was the fact that a lady who ultimately becomes a nun writes this book called The Rule. And the intent of the rule was to put it real basic, provide an education for young women to become good wives or to live a very religious life in the community. Because if you think about that period of time, women were not necessarily educated at all. And the other aspect of it was the Catholic faith in Europe was cloistered. They really didn't go out to talk to the people. They went to the convent, and there they began to become nuns, so forth, to study to become nuns. The Catholic faith realized back then that they were not meeting the needs of the people when they're cloistered, especially since they saw the Lutherans out there doing that. So rather than to lose membership, they said, well, maybe we ought to just venture out from behind these walls. And that's what they did. And it begins to grow out of that aspect.
What
Yes,
country did they begin?
they began in France, right? And so the order took on this teachings of the rule, and I cover that quite extensively in the book and what it meant. And I wrote some little things down here, so I keep keeping things in mind. So as the order grew, which is in the book, I think it's good reading if you like how the religious impact came to the United States. By 1726, now keeping in mind here, 1726, so Columbus has long time been to America. The Ursuline Order ultimately makes the decision that they were going to come to America, which we call the United States. And they arrive through New Orleans. And if you go to New Orleans, there is even an Ursuline museum there in New Orleans. And I got a lot of my resource material from actually a lady who wrote a book about the Ursuline Order that's down in New Orleans. And I think I have a big conference coming up in January, I was told. I might even go to that. So that's where it begins. It's very interesting, as I put in the book, the reason I have to put everything in about the Ursuline Order is because when I cover the history of Nazareth Hall. The similarities are phenomenal, including the design of the building. It's the first school building that they built in New Orleans. And you can imagine what it was like in the 1700s. That kind of architecture was brought back into, and I have a rendition of that building in the book. So let me see my next. See if we got something here. Unless I'm going the wrong direction. Okay, and that's the backside of Nazareth Hall. Oh, no, that's okay. Yeah, it'll be all right. And then during the winter months, that gives you another view of Nazareth Hall. And again, and nothing's changed with regards to the architecture of the building. And I address that in the book. It's actually a beautiful book, or building. And there, of course, is a statue of Lady Gabriel. This was moved when the new owners bought the building, and they moved it closer to the building, but it used to sit right outside by the road of Route 65. Is everybody familiar with or having seen the building there on Route 65? Okay. All right, let's see what we got here. Okay, and I put some documents in the book, and so let's just progress here, and because if anybody has questions, we get past the Ursulines traveling northward, and they come northward. I'm sure this, this is a contract by, if you recognize the name Farnsworth. Farnsworth supplied Nazareth Hall with all their nursery stuff. And so let me explain where we're at here, all right? Without getting ahead of myself, I'm trying to keep in perspective the book and what I want to talk about. When the idea of building Nazareth Hall, it was the concept of then Bishop Stritch, which in Toledo is Cardinal Stritch High School. He later becomes a cardinal. Bishop Stritch wanted to have a community. And it was to be a community that was going to, first and foremost, bring young girls into the community to become nuns. And then secondly, it was to bring young boys there for the purpose of the priesthood. The young girls that were being brought there, of course, whether they became a nun or not, they were to, again, adhere to the philosophy of the Ursuline Order and learn how to become good mothers and wives when they marry. So Bishop Stritch decided that this would be the place for that. And the church, the Toledo Diocese, bought 440 acres of land that Nazareth Hall set on. And that was supposed to become the community. Yes.
Did the children live there at the school?
Yes, they did. So once the land was purchased, Bishop Stritch basically washed his hands of the whole deal. And he says to the Ursuline nuns, you take care of it. They actually became the subcontractors. And I got a lot of indications in there about contracts being awarded, because the contracts that were awarded were by local builders in this area of Wood County. So in once the land was purchased, and I have all that in the book, who they bought it for and so forth and so on. The whole concept was, how are we going to support this school? And the concept was, they turned it over to the sisters and said, here's what you have to do. You got 440 acres, build a school on it for young girls and boys, and figure out how you're gonna pay for it. Well, they decided they'd farm it. And one of the things they did was sign that contract with Farnsworth. they brought in fruit trees and bushes and everything because they were going to farm the land, which they did. So they were growing fruit not only to sell, but they were also growing all these products to support in their own school to pay for the meals for the students, so they didn't have to go out and purchase that. So they got started 3 to 4 years in advance of the school opening. And the school opened in 1928. So they took on the first class of students at Nazareth Hall. Now, keeping in mind, remember I said you got to think of events. What happens in 1929?
Right.
The Depression. In the end, it had a huge impact on Nazareth Hall, because now how are they going to make ends meet when people could not send their children there and pay tuition? So that, and I want to point this out so I don't forget it. The Ursuline sisters never turned away a student for the inability to pay. Whether that was good or bad, but they never did that. And so they struggled through 1929. And I think for many of us, we're of the age, we remember the bank from Toledo called Toledo Trust. Toledo Trust financed Nazareth Hall through a promissory note through the Toledo Diocese. That note was never called in during the Depression. Even though they couldn't make the payment, they let it go. So the sisters struggled, and let me tell you why I have so much information going back to the 1920s. I was entrusted with the diary of one of the nuns that stayed there. I don't know of anybody else who has ever read that diary. And let me tell you the reason why they believed in me, going way back actually with my masters. My cousin, I was from a large family of 10 uncles and aunts, 11 uncles and aunts. And my father was godfather for one of my cousins, who was Sister Jane Mary, a Catholic nun. And she is the artist at Lourdes University that did all the murals on all the walls there. And she just passed away 2 years ago at the age of 93. And so when I went to the Ursuline Mother House and talked to them about doing this, and they knew myself through Sister Jane Mary, they knew right away I was going to write any scandals, I guess. So they entrusted me with that diary. So I've got an awful lot of personal notes and stories from the nuns who stayed in the house, because Nazareth Hall could not be, they couldn't live there at the time of construction, but they already planted all those trees and everything. So they lived on a house in Western Road, and it was very primitive. As a matter of fact, it was so primitive, the one nun wrote that during the winter, the cold air would blow through the floorboards. So, and even after the Nazareth Hall was almost completed, and they used to save the candles from the wax, and they would melt the wax so it would fill the cracks in the boards. So the air would come up, and they put screens on windows. They had it very difficult there. So the Ursuline Orders took that on in 1928 with the first group of students. And remember, and by the way, it was not called Nazareth Hall at the very beginning. It was called Lady Glen on the River. And so there's the name change. There was so many different changes in Nazareth Hall as it went along. And if you've been on the grounds, the 440 acres encompassed a lot of things. Shortly after Nazareth Hall was built, managing the farm had to be done. The sisters did a lot of the work. And now they would teach all day, and they would also manage the farm. So they hired a gentleman, and there was other ladies in the area, but they hired a gentleman to become the farm manager. And he was a recent immigrant from Bavaria. And I knew him very well. That was Otto Stockman. And Otto and Teresa worked in the kitchen, Otto worked on the farm, and that was his area of expertise. So two things they did there, they raised hogs, and the other were turkeys. And the turkeys were called Lady Glen turkeys. And these turkeys not only supported meals for the boys, but also, for the fact to create goodwill in the community. For whatever reason, and I don't have a reason for it, but, the Catholics were not very well received at that time. As a matter of fact, Wood County attempted to tax the school. And the nuns had to take that to court and they ultimately won. They were trying to, a large sum of money for property tax, on that building. But they got through that. And, I don't know if I have some pictures of that. Let me see what I have next here. That's Otto driving the wagon. That's the way things were done there. He was a young man at that time. Otto and Teresa lived not too far from me, and he would always say he was from Bavaria, not Germany. Let me see here. And there is a first graduating class making their first communion there. And as you can see, it's not a military school. It is Nazareth Hall. So the students went there and they also got their Catholic education. As was, excuse me?
There's one girl.
Yes, yeah, okay, that's a good point, because any person who worked, and there was a few ladies who worked there, and the Stockner girls and the Ock family was another one, they had children. And as a result, what they would do is they could attend the school, and that's why she was there. But even when they became a military school, they catered to the young boys. And the girls, like in this case, if she was in a class, she was in the back of the class. She was not to be a distraction to the boys. As I think about this, you know, I've done so much research. Let me tell you, Nazareth Hall was built where it was built because there was a lot of land available in that area in the 20s. At the first location was towards Kellogg Road in 65. But the sister, the nun, the head nun there, she says, no, we don't want to build there. She says, it's too close to town and we'll get these boys going into town and it'll be crowded. So, and again, you got to remember, it's not a military school as yet. It's just a school that students would have a little bit more leisure activity. So they ultimately moved about 4 miles further down 65. But that's the reason there's a girl in the photograph. And the boys in uniform, I'm not quite sure why they were in uniform, but it could be after. Again, this is an example. They had the horses and the wagons, and the nuns were all part of that. Whatever they did. There is so much in the book that I couldn't speak to you about in an hour, but remember, there's not much automobile traffic. And people coming out to Nazareth Hall at that time took the rail. And the rail would get all the way to Waterville, or it was called the Erie Railroad, I think, at that time. So, you know, transportation to Nazareth Hall was quite different. So the sisters survived for quite a while, with being able to suffice on the land there and growing. They had great. Actually, the vineyard was to the front of the building, because in the back there's a valley or a hollow, and back there is a grotto, and that grotto was built to be equal to the grotto of Fatima, where we've all heard the story of Bernadette and the scene. So they built that, and that they still hold ceremonial weddings, not Catholic weddings, because once Nazareth Hall was sold, which is still in existence, but once it was sold, the Catholic Church desanctified the altar inside the Nazareth Hall, as well as, so no Catholic wedding can be performed there by a priest. Weddings by other religious groups can, with a minister or so forth. And during the summer months, they do have weddings down in the grotto area, which is a beautiful facility. And that grotto, and I'm thinking it was 1959, if I remember, a tornado sort of destroyed it a little bit, came through there. But they used to have an ability to go inside behind the stone walls and so forth, but they closed that all up. And then Hog Barn used to be back there also. It's the only piece of research, and I talked to a lot of people about this. There was a fire that killed all the hogs. I thought there was about 90 hogs at one time over there. And I went through the Sentinel archives and I found nothing about newspaper articles. I talked to fire chiefs from that time, especially out of Weston and Grand Rapids. Nobody has record of that, but it's documented in some of the files at the hog farm. So after the sisters get through 1920s. In 1935, the decision was made that they would become a military school. And they would ask the military to be part of, they wouldn't teach the classes, but what they would do is they would go into a transformation of a disciplinary type of school for young boys. From what I gather and putting things together, there seems to have been, because of the Depression years, a loss of the family fabric. Parents were so hard pressed in everything they did that many lost control of their children. The boys became a little rambunctious. My father, who's passed away, and I'm hoping you don't get even with me here. He once told me that had Nazareth Hall been built when he was a young boy, and he was born in 1907. He says, I certainly would have been a student there. He was a rambunctious young man. So as a result, they converted to this military school. Now, this is 1935. Everything is, and the book, I think you'll find interesting. The daily routine, yes.
When it was turned into a military school, did the nuns still do the teaching
Yes, they
of
did.
the boys?
Yes, they did. They did the teaching and they did everything there. They did the cooking in the kitchen.
But they didn't live there.
Yes, they did. By that time, they lived on the top floor.
Oh, okay.
And that was off limits for all the boys. They could not go, they could not go up there. Then they had a chapel. If their entire day was regimented, and I put I even put the entire copy of the handbook for the students and what they had to do. You can't imagine how regimented it was. I should tell you that students who came to Nazareth Hall, some of them that came there were not just students from the area. Students from other countries came to Nazareth Hall for the purpose, their parents sent them there to learn English. And when I was doing my research, one of the students that I found that attended there had the last name of Fox, Fox. Now, if you want to go back in history, because his brother was Vicente Fox, the president of Mexico. And Vicente Fox visited Toledo here not long ago. And of course, Toledo, sometimes there's small minds. Nobody did any research. You would have thought they would have said to Vicente, your brother went to Nazareth Hall. And it would have allowed him to come out to that, but they didn't do that. But I knew that. They didn't ask me. God forbid. But they were sent there, so the nuns, that behavior, that strict and to learn English. And they came from many parts of the world, came to Nazareth Hall. So as a result, the regimented days was that they did have to attend mass in the morning. And it didn't matter if you were Catholic or non-Catholic, you attended mass. I didn't really come across anybody in interviews of past students at Nazareth Hall that said, no, I was Protestant. And so they were always saying, no, I was associated with the Catholic faith. And of course, there was no school at St. Patrick's across the road. That was just a church there. So the students had their uniforms and they had to get dressed and it was all, if you're ever in the military, I was Army. You have this routine. You get up and they reveille. They had a guy out there, a young boy, played reveille to get up. And they had so much time to dress and groom themselves and get down for breakfast. And I just spoke to a gentleman the other day who delivered milk there. And he says he'll never forget that when he walked in and he was making the delivery to the kitchen with the milk. He says the students were sitting at the table waiting to be told that they could now eat and they could now speak. It was just that it was almost like a prison atmosphere, but it was a disciplinary atmosphere. And by your age, it was your duty of what you did in there, about taking the food out of the kitchen, cleaning up the tables, and then you got all this done on a time. So by the time that ended, then it was off to class. When it came to leisure time, there were times that the parents could visit. They could visit twice a month, only on Sunday for a certain period of time. And on some occasions, depending, they could only meet in the lobby of the, they never got to go upstairs or anywhere else. They met in the lobby of Nazareth Hall. That's how disciplined it was. And it was just there was no rebellion to that. I think I even have some code or something. Let me see what else I got here. Oh, there's during the winter delivering things. All the school children being pulled by the horses. Because this is the farm atmosphere. See what else I have here. Okay. Just because now this, even though it would be a military school, you have to have a social life. So as a result, they did not forget events like this, putting on a play on the stage and dressing up whatever it was, and the play was conducted for the boys, and of course the stage is still there. I think I've got another one. Here, it's Halloween. Remember trying to eat an apple off a string? They want the children to have socialization. Even to the point that when the students got to 8th grade, they were able to have a prom. And they met with girls from St. Ursula, the school in Toledo. And they would go out to the Naval Academy in Toledo, and that's where they would hold their prom. And I don't think I have a slide here of it, but I do have a slide of a young girl. We are beginning to show our age here, signing her dance card. And for every boy that she danced with, she would sign the name, so she could say she socialized. Let me see, yeah. And of course, the back hill and the sledding on the back hill there. So that's the back side of Nazareth Hall. I have, like I said, I have almost 200 slides of things like that the sisters allowed me to, let's see what else I have here. Oh, here's a good example. This is the prom.
Oh, yeah.
And the girls and the young men in their uniforms. They would even be part of parades if there was any type of parade in Toledo, because they called it the parade grounds, which is the parking lot. And that was my first introduction. I guess how I came about writing about Nazareth Hall. I'm a Michigander. I played ball there, and so I transformed myself down here in Ohio. But I come off a farm, and I was always looking for farmland. And at that time, I had just married, and we're traveling on 65, and I indicated in the book why I was out this way. But I purchased a farm out here, and which I still have. But I drove past Nazareth Hall, and it intrigued me to see that. One summer day, I was driving past, and the students were out on the parade ground. They were marching out there because the drill instructor was military. And I said, geez, what are students doing out here? I was not familiar with Nazareth Hall. I was up in Michigan, you know? And that's when I had this interest of what kind of building or school is that? And that was my first indicator, and they used to do drills and marching band and so forth, on that parade ground. Let's see what other slide I put in here. Oh, there's a typical classroom, and you can see the boys all in uniform. And this is the library. The boys had to write home. Because again, many of the boys weren't from the area, so they had to write home. But the sisters always censored all the. They were looking over their shoulders and they mailed their letters for them. But that was the library room that they had. And this again is a graduation of some sort. I keep thinking this is a confirmation because they're too old to be making their first communion. That's the grotto. That's to the rear of the building, and that's a current picture. And the people love to go there and have their wedding ceremony there at Nazareth Hall. There's the buglers for Reveille, and you can see the uniforms changed through the years because they have to purchase them. And you can see they have capes here, and so they had music classes. The band, I don't think I have a picture of it. It was called the Bud Sherman Band. This is in the cafeteria, eating, and you can see the nuns in the back overseeing. You ate everything. That's. I spent time when I was in Korea. I was invited. I spent time with a monk up in Zalbus, and I'll never forget what they told me. Of course, I ate a lot of kimchi, but they said you can take as much as you want to eat, but don't leave anything on your plate. I'll never forget them telling me that, not to be wasteful. Now it's quite an experience I had there. And this lady, she lost her husband and had no means of supporting the children. And she sent all her 4 boys to Nazareth Hall. And of course, you can see the uniform. And I know for a fact she did not have the ability to pay tuition for all 4 boys. But like I said, the nuns never asked for any money.
She was lucky she had.
Excuse me.
She was lucky she had boys.
Yeah, for sure. That's true. This is Sister Mary Patrick. She was the last principal at Nazareth Hall. Her and I had nice conversations before she retired, and she's passed away since. I know there are no nuns that are still living today that taught at Nazareth Hall. It's like my teachers in high school. I'm saying, and this is, well, I won't get ahead of myself. Let me get back here. So Nazareth Hall progresses through the generations. So 1928, it's dedicated and opens. 1982, it closes. And if you trace the decades, it was impacted tremendously. And I'll do this very quickly. We've already mentioned about the Depression in the 20s and the rebuilding into the 30s. Well, the next major event that'll hit Nazareth Hall is going to be World War II. And many of the workers that were helping on the farm at that time went and did their call to duty. One of my neighbors, Gerald Warner, I call him Farmer Warner. He was one of them that went off. So the nuns were hard pressed for labor on the farm because they were still farming 400 acres. They were always creative. So I made sure I mentioned in the book where they got their labor from. And anybody want to make a guess? It wasn't women. Prisoners of war, German prisoners of war. They made an agreement with the Defense Department that the prisoners of war were being held out at Camp Perry in Fort Clinton. And they transferred them to jail here in Bowling Green. And every day, one of the officers would bring the prisoners out to the farm to farm. And I found they'd written some of the early prisoners that were brought there were only 16 years of age. They were captured and brought over. So, at that period of time already, the wars were winding down. And of course, youth was being used to fight for Germany in World War II. The first group that came out there, they thought they were going to be brought out there to be executed.
Oh.
Concept of why would you bring me from there to here to out the, remember, it's 1940. But they were relieved as soon as the Ursuline nuns that were there, many of them spoke German. So as a result, they put them to ease, and then the Ursuline nuns took the soldiers under their wing and said, you know, they would come out there with a bag for lunch. And the Ursuline said they were working so hard here, you can't eat without a bag. So they said, can we fix them food? And the military said they can eat you can prepare them anything they can eat with a spoon. Cause they couldn't give them a knife or a fork. And I was talking to Otto one day, he always would invite me over and want to talk to me about the old days. He says, yeah, he says they bring the prisoners. He said, I'd always sneak them beer. He says, you know, good German, but he may be Bavarian, but he was still German at heart, so he'd bring them beer, you know. So they used the prisoners of war, and they were hard workers, and then all talked about them. So you get through the 1940s, and then of course the 50s weren't as impacted as with the Korean War, but the time became where what is going to cause the demise? That the sisters weren't making money. One of the nuns actually went to Ohio State University to see what she could do with the farm to make it more productive. To say, can we make more money off of the farm? It just wasn't happening. So they keep trying to, and the Catholic Diocese is not subsidizing them in any way. It's all in the hands of the sisters. So where's the demise? You know, you say, okay, it goes until 1982. Well, the 70s must have really been impactful on them, and it was. And there's an event in this country, and it's called the Vietnam War. And the reason the Vietnam War had a great impact on Nazareth Hall and its enrollment, which kept going down, is parents were fearful that sending their students to Nazareth Hall would be preparing them for training to go to fight in Vietnam. So they said, no, I don't think we want to put our children in uniform for that purpose. So when it got to be in the 70s, it just wasn't possible. It wasn't going to happen.
So what was the grade ages or levels for NAS?
For first through eighth grade, right? And from there, the students and it was a sound education. You know, when you think of the time, there wasn't the necessity to have chemistry and physics and so forth, like students are having, and I even had in school. So it makes a big difference. So by the time they were struggling and they couldn't make ends meet, and of course they had the auction of everything inside the building. So now the building sat idle in the 80s, and there was what do you do with it? So the land was sold off to area farmers, and there was left with about the building of 40 acres. Different interests came up. Oh, I want to mention one other thing. There used to be a swimming pool. Again, I want to keep in mind about the decades, okay, and then we jump through the 50s here. The students would swim in the Maumee River. I have pictures of the priests overseeing them swimming in the river and so forth. But then there was the polio epidemic. And they thought polio was being contracted from the water in the Maumee. So they built a swimming pool right behind the building. That's not there any longer. They took that down, but that was for recreation. They could swim in the swimming pool. So there was the events throughout. You need to consciously, as you read the book and you think about these things, you say, geez, yeah, I remember that, you know, and it was impacting Nazareth Hall all along. So the building sat idle, and the Ursulines were very fearful because, you know, rumor got out the place was haunted. So people would try to break into it, and the worst part was that there was a fireplace on the second floor, and they would get there in the winter, and they were fearful that somebody would start a fire and the flue would catch on fire and the place would burn down. So they said, we've got to sell the place, and there was different entities came forward wanting to purchase it. And I remember one entity that, because I was president of the school board at Otsego at the time. And a gentleman from down in Columbus came up here and he wanted to purchase it to make it into a school for boys. And I said, well, that's great. I says, preserve the school. And I said, so you're going to bring teachers and everything? He said, oh, no, we're gonna send all the boys to Otsego. I said, I don't think that's gonna happen. So, I'm glad I asked that question, and he said, well, why? And I said, well, you can't do that. I says, you're gonna call it a school, you're not gonna pay taxes, and then you're gonna dump all the students into, and there's gonna be students that are not necessarily, ready to go to school. So that never came about, so it's good for another year. And then finally, the Bettinger family came forward and said, we would like to purchase it for the purpose that it's being used today. And that is for receptions, weddings, whatever. But there was one condition, and the one condition is that the structure of the building would not be changed, exteriorly. Interiorly, there were some things needed to be done in the basement, as far as, supports that, needed to be up to, the code needed to be upgraded. But that was the only thing that Nazareth Hall did to the school, and then they moved the statue back towards the school. And they've done a good job of it because Rob Bettinger has taken over for his dad, and they have collected a lot of archival things. I gave them I had the blueprints to the building. So I gave them the blueprints to the building when it was constructed, and I told them, I said, I'm getting to the point where I'm done with the book. I said, I'm going to give them all the slides and things like that. So they've taken it over, and just like the picture, that's how they fix the rooms up. So when they have a wedding, they do tours there. Here's another interior of the building. They did not take out the lockers or anything that was in there. See if we got any more. That would be the last one. So that was so that's Nazareth Hall and what it's being used for, President. I'll answer any questions. This is the book that I wrote. Of course, it shows Nazareth Hall, and there's a picture that I found of the first time it was completed. You notice there's no trees around it or anything, but as we know it today. Any questions about Nazareth Hall? Yes.
You have any good stories about what was in that nun's diary?
You know, I'll tell you this, the good stories is, stories with regards to their personal, interactions while being there. And, they would have a sense of humor. For example, the one nun that worked in the kitchen, and they would never call her by her name or the students. That she was the one sister that was like, okay, you can go. She made such delicious meals. They called her Sister Yum Yum. So every time when I read in the thing, it says, oh, because the nuns would eat the food she made also. Also about sick children. And they did have a nurse, but she wasn't there all the time. And the nuns tended to show, if we've had children, they get sick at night, what do? And they had all these students sleeping in like dorm bunks and so forth. And the nuns would care for them. I interviewed a young man who was a student there, and he was from, I can't remember what state, but while there, his father passed away. And the nuns were notified, and because he was sleeping, they did not wake him to tell him. They were compassionate, and they said, well, wait till morning, there's nothing he can do about it now, and be up all night. So when he woke, they took him to the side and told him that his father had passed. And he says he remembered that, being told. So the stories that were in there were that, and then the stories like being in the putting the wax between the boards that was so cold. I never came across a student that said they were hard, they were disciplined in a harsh manner, or I never even came across one that was spanked, because they did have a book, and I put the book in there where you could get demerits, and the demerits meant something. And I even have a picture of one of the students gave me their grade card and showing what they got graded on and so forth. It was when the military aspect took over, it was really the students, and talking to former students, they didn't have a problem with it. they said, look, it was a discipline, my parents sent me there, they had socialization. So, but the diary gave me a real idea of following through with the philosophy of the Ursuline Order. Any other things you'd like to add? Yes,
How many, how many students would be there? And how many nuns were there?
there was.
Do they have figures?
Yeah, I do. There was usually, to teach classes, about 6 to 8 sisters. And then as far as students, the largest enrollment they had at any time, and I gave the figures, matter of fact, I show a chart and how the numbers went up and down in comparison to Toledo, actually. And the fact that there would be anywhere from 28 to 40 students there at one time. There was that many, but the nuns were used for teaching classes. And yes,
So how do you think people found out about this place from another state or another?
probably through the Catholic diocese, because they, you know, they would, the bishops, of course, would go by, it was always, I have this school. As a matter of fact, even on the day of the dedication, the nuns were selling things already to make money. You know, always to benefit, and they had to cater to the priests. Anytime the priests came there, they had to cater to them. Because then they built the building next to Nazareth Hall, which they called the rectory, and they would stay there, and the sisters had to take care of those priests. And there was a table out in front. The priests would never eat off of the same plates as the students ate. They had their separate cabinet with their own plates and everything. They felt they were.
Yeah.
Well, I felt sorry for the sisters.
So. How did the diocese? Why did they stay separate from?
They didn't want them in the schools. I shouldn't say
They
this.
support them in some way.
They didn't.
I know, why didn't they?
It was like a separate entity, and they wanted it to become that community. That's what they really wanted. You know, I'll give you a prime example, because my dad, when he went to school, all his classes were taught in Polish, and then he ultimately ended up going to school in one of the Polish communities, which was in Toledo, LaGrange Street, the St. Hedwig's Church. And in speaking to my dad, they did a history of St. Hedwig's, and this is a good question. When they did the history of St. Hedwig's, they had pictures of all the students from their graduating classes. So I asked my dad, I said, "Hey, Dad, your picture in here?" He said, "Oh, yeah." He says, "Oh, take a look." So I go back to I don't think it was 1916 or something like that. He's and there's a picture here and a picture here. And I look at it, I said, "Which one's you?" And he said, "I'm that person right there." And I look at the two pictures and I said, "Hey, Dad," I said, "was the situation, there was he's with 8 other boys. And then there's this class of 40. And I said, "Dad," I says, "were you not present when they took this picture that you had to do a makeup?" He says, "No, I was there." And then I look, and the priest is sitting in the middle, and they got a couple nuns on each side. I says, "Well, where's the priests and nuns?" He says, "They wouldn't pose with us." My dad was a real rebel, and that's why he said I'd be at Nazareth Hall.
Oh.
And that would be not only the truth at St. Hedwig, it would be through many of those Catholic schools throughout Toledo for the Irish, or on Nebraska Avenue for the other Polish community. They wanted to separate the rambunctious kids. It wasn't like they were stealing and robbing. They just had a different, and my dad became very productive. He had 46 years as a mill-rated chief, so, it's that's just the way it was, from the farm to the Jeep plant. Any other questions? Yes.
Find anything about this building, how for being used? It's they've got a traffic ticket or something, and they would. Time.
They have, if you get a DUI, you have to go out there.
Oh, yes, I didn't mention that. That was when the Benningers bought it. That was one way, and they used the upstairs. And they made an agreement with Wood County, and it was for, if you had a DUI, you would go there. But it just wasn't working out for them from what they wanted to do, especially weekends. because you would have the individuals up on the, for DUI, and we had a wedding party down the block. And probably some of those people are gonna end up. Yes,
Have you ever had any of the students work the grounds?
no, never came across any students that worked the grounds, not at all. No, and they, as a matter of fact, my cousin who was a nun, she said she was a camp counselor out there during the summer because they would bring young girls out there for camp. And that would be in the 1950s for girls' camp. But again, to expose, is run through the Catholic schools and maybe expose them to saying, look, you could maybe become a nun, because it's very difficult to get priests and nuns today. Any other, yes?
I know they had a horse stables too, because my mom rode horses and at one point they asked her to be a trainer there during the summer. She never did, but I know they had a.
Right, because they use the horses extensively. I have a picture, actually. I don't know if it's the same one. Well, yeah, it shows, I just brought that in. And it shows a young girl on a horse, and they had her riding horses over there. They tried to give them as much socialization as they could there.
Yeah, my dad and my uncles went to school there.
Did they?
Yeah, but it was my grandfather's belief that it was a good preparation for high school and then college, so. But yeah, my dad and all my uncles.
What year would that be?
Like 1937.
Yeah, see,
something like that.
it was 35, it became the military school.
Yeah, because in their town, there wasn't very many good schools.
No,
so-
there wasn't. That's exactly right. And there was a lot of horse business. I remember Otto called me one time. I grew up, it wasn't anything I could do with farm animals. And he says, I have a horse that hooves need to be trimmed. He says, could you come over and do it? I go, well, I said, yeah, I could, I've done that many times, but it was a Shetland pony. I almost had to stand in a hole. I trimmed him because Otto was a good guy. I miss him dearly, but he was an old timer, you know, he was, I had a lot of interaction there, with them, but yeah, they did have that also.
Yeah, my grandfather, he was from another country, from Belgium, I think.
Mhm.
So he believed the boys should go away to school, to like boarding schools, and then the girls stayed at home. So all my dad and his uncles all were shipped out there.
Yeah.
So
And
it wasn't that they were rambunctious, but that's just what.
But it was a staunch education and
Yeah,
they got a good education. There was a gentleman who came back and was the basketball coach, there, and you mentioned like football, but they did have a basketball team that competed and they had uniforms, his name was Rutherford. And, he was a stock nurse, well, his wife married Rutherford. Or his sister did, yeah. Any other questions? You've been a good audience. All good? Yep. Yeah, I'm gonna get, well, I thank you so much, and like I said, if you wanna purchase books, I brought some books in. And I'm gonna unplug this so nobody trips on the cord. If you decide you wanna, you can